Ballots, bias and boundaries. Before the 2010 general election, a lot of people became very confused when they learned that in order for the Conservatives to win an overall majority, in terms of the national vote share, the party needed a big lead over Labour to achieve that. By comparison, if Labour should win the general election, its lead over the Conservatives would be much, much smaller. So many people were puzzled why the Tories needed a big lead and why Labour only needed a small lead. Was the voting system rigged in favour of Labour, and had the fact that Labour had been in charge when the boundary revisions had taken place, had that contributed to the inbuilt bias towards Labour? So the point of this exercise is to explain where electoral bias comes from, the various factors that contribute towards electoral bias, and why any revision of constituency boundaries might not actually reduce the size of Labour's bias relative to the Conservatives as much as people think. So the political context in 2010 was manifesto pledges to reduce the House of Commons. The Conservatives in particular wanted new constituency boundaries to remove this so-called pro-Labour bias in the system caused by those boundaries being unfairly drawn, and of course the Liberal Democrats simply wanted a different voting system altogether. When we come to think about electoral bias and its decomposition, in other words, the various bits that make up electoral bias, then the first name that comes to mind is Ralph Brooks, a New Zealand political scientist who developed a method for bias decomposition. And he did so as he could better understand the New Zealand system, which was a clear two-party system. Later on, other people have come along and added bits and pieces to the Brooks method to try and cope with a growing third-party presence in the UK. And Ron Johnson from the University of Bristol has led those teams. The problem with the Brooks method, and really subsequent attempts to modify it, is the combined two-party share in Great Britain has been in decline. The graph there shows you that from the 1950s onwards it's been steadily declining, so much so that just over 60% of the GB Great Britain vote in 2010 went to Conservative or Labour, and the remainder went to Liberal Democrats and various other parties. So what we've got a problem here is that we're trying to apply a method that was devised for a two-party system to a party system that's increasingly not two-party. So there began a search for a new method. Ron Johnson and ourselves here in Plymouth tried to find a method that would work to decompose electoral bias for a three-party system. And after various attempts, we came up with this method that we are going to use here. A technical paper appears in Electoral Studies. A more descriptive pattern of the 2010 general election, which I'll touch upon towards the end of this, is published elsewhere. The first thing to point out, though, is a confusion that many people understandably have, that they confuse electoral bias with disproportionality, and it's fairly understandable why that's the case. But let me just try and explain why disproportionality is not the same thing as electoral bias. So this is the graph showing the outcome in 1997. The first red column shows Labour's percentage share of the national vote, and the second column shows their percentage of seats in the House of Commons. And of course Blair won a big landslide at that election. There's a 20 percentage point difference between votes and seats for Labour at that general election, and we can call that, if you like, Blair's bonus. This is a well-known feature of first past the post voting. We've known about it for many years. It's the winner's bonus, and this is disproportionality. The well-known effect of first past the post is to give the leading party a much greater share of seats than its vote deserved. Well, there's nothing unusual about this. For example, in 1983, the blue column shows there Mrs. Thatcher's national vote share, and again the second column her share of the seats in the House of Commons, and there's a 19-point difference between the share of seats and the share of votes. This too, in 1983, just as in 1997, was a highly disproportional outcome. But that's not to say that it was necessarily a biased outcome. So let's having looked at disproportionality, now let's look at what comprises bias. So let's look at the situation after the 2010 general election. And so what we've got is all the results, and what we're now trying to do is to work out, applying uniform swing, i.e. the same level of change in share of the vote to each and every constituency, what national picture would we have to have for the Conservatives to win an overall majority in the House of Commons of 20 seats? And when we do the arithmetic, it comes up with this figure. For a Conservative majority of 20, the Conservatives would have to have a national vote share of 39.7%, whilst Labour would only would need to get 27%. What about a Labour majority of 20? Well, a rather different pattern emerges. So for Labour to win a majority of 20, the Conservatives would need to be on 31% of the vote, Labour just on 35%, a 4-point difference. In other words, yet again, Labour requires just a 4-point lead over the Conservatives to win a majority of 20, whereas for a Conservative majority of 20 there needs to be a 13-point lead over Labour. So there is electoral bias present in the system, and the point of this exercise is to try and discover why. So let's go back to Brooke, and let's start with a hypothetical country. Well, I know this doesn't look like a hypothetical country. That looks rather familiar, actually. So there's all the 650 constituencies being coloured in, and that doesn't look like a hypothetical country either. But yes, that one is. What we've got here is a country that has exactly 100 constituencies, and rather conveniently, each square therefore represents 1% of the total seats. This helps considerably with the arithmetic. Let's assume in our examples that parties A and B each win exactly 50% of the national vote share. So it's a dead heat in terms of the national vote. However, in terms of the distribution of seats, it turns out that Party A wins 58 of the 100 seats, and Party B only wins 42 of the seats, even though they've got exactly the same number of votes. So we can quickly conclude that the system is biased towards Party A and biased against Party B. Why? There are three main components of bias that I want to talk about here. First, electorate. Second, turnout. Pattern of vote shares is third. So I'm going to run through three examples, and I'm going to focus on each of these three in turn. So in the first example, we've got unequally sized constituencies. So we're going to play around with electorate. We're going to assume that turnout is 100% everywhere, being good citizens, everyone votes in this hypothetical country. And we're also going to assume that there's just two parties, of course, and that when a party wins, it wins with 60% of the vote, and when it comes second, it gets 40% of the vote. So exactly the same turnout, same pattern of vote shares, winner and the second place, but the electorates are different. What does this look like? Well, we've got 50 electorates with 50 constituencies rather with electorates below the national average, and you can see that in our hypothetical country the squares have been reduced in size to reflect that 80,000, and in the other half we've got electorates above the national average. Okay, so let's look at the election. Party A is in red, the party B is in blue, and we see there, again, the shading reflects the different electorates, and here's the election result. The blue party has won the seats outlined in blue, and the red party has won all of the seats outlined in red. And you can very quickly see that the red party has won more seats than has the blue party. Let's look at three constituencies. Because we're calculating the national vote share, we know that the turnout is 100% everywhere, but we know that the electorates in some constituencies are smaller on average, and in other constituencies they are bigger than average. And it follows therefore that each constituency is contributing slightly different votes towards the national vote share. So on the top one here, it's the red party, it's won, but with rather, although it's won 60 to 40, its contribution of this constituency to the national vote share is much smaller than it is here and it is here, simply because these are larger constituencies. So let's consider the whole general election. So we've been up all night, we've been watching the results coming in, and unbelievably at the end of the day, Party A wins 5 million votes and Party B wins 5 million votes also. It's a dead heat in terms of the national vote share. But of course, as you all know, the national vote share does not determine seats in the House of Commons. So, because we've got unequally sized constituencies, Party A has won 58% of the seats with just 50% of the votes. So there's the national vote, and there's the national seats. And the explanation for why those graphs are different, why this is a dead heat, but why this is 58 and this is only 42, lies here in this graph. It's quite clear that the red party's won all the small constituencies and a few, 8 in fact, of the large constituencies, but the blue party has concentrated all of its support in the large constituency areas, and for that reason it got the same national vote as did the red party, but that's also the reason why it didn't get the same number of seats. So the system is biased because of towards the red party and against the blue party, simply because the electorates are different. Moving on, let's think about turnout. In this example, we're going to keep electorate constant. We're going to assume that they're all equal. We're also, again, going to keep the pattern of vote shares the same, 60% for the winner, 40% for the second, but now we're going to play around with turnout. We're going to vary turnout. It's 53% in half the constituencies and 80% in the remaining half. Going to our hypothetical country once again and colouring in our constituencies. Here the shading is just over half, representing 53% of turnout, whereas in these other constituencies the shading in yellow is 80% is coloured in there, reflecting the level of turnout. Here's the election. Those bordered in blue are won by the blue party. Those bordered in red are won by the red party, same as before. Let's look at in detail at two constituencies, and you can see because of the higher turnout in the constituency won by the blue party, it's going to be contributing more votes towards the national vote share than is the constituency won here by the red party. So let's think about the whole election. Here we see the national vote. It's odd, isn't it, how many elections we're running here where the national vote is exactly the same. But look at the seats again. So here, 58% of the seats won by the red party, but only 42% of the seats won by the blue party. And the explanation, again, lies with this graph. The red parties won all of the lower turnout areas and a few of the higher turnout areas, whereas the blue party's vote has been, its victories rather, have been concentrated in the high turnout areas. So much so that the vote shares are equal in terms of the national picture, but the red party has won more seats for its votes than has the blue party. We can conclude from this that the system is biased in favour of the red party and against the blue party because of differences in turnout. For this example, we're going to assume that the constituencies are the same. The turnout is, again, everyone being good citizens, it's 100%, but now we're going to change the pattern of vote shares. So vote shares are going to vary across constituencies. Before I get to this point, though, a little bit of an explanation is probably required. The slide is headlined "Win Small, Lose Big," and I'll explain. Let's identify two kinds of votes: surplus votes and wasted votes. Surplus votes are any votes won by a party winning the constituency by more than one vote. So if a constituency is won by a candidate by one vote, there are no surplus votes. You need to have one vote more than your nearest challenger. If the constituency is won by 20,000 votes, however, then you could say that 19,999 of those 20,000 votes are surplus. They were unnecessary. By contrast, wasted votes are all votes acquired by a party that do not contribute towards a seat. So if I lose a constituency by one vote, all of the votes that I've accumulated are wasted. They weren't transferred into a seat. Now I know this is going to upset some people's sensitivities, but for this experiment we're going to conclude that surplus and wasted votes are ineffective votes. And then we're going to make the statement that nationally the smaller a party's ineffective votes, i.e. the smaller the number of surplus and wasted votes combined, the smaller a party's ineffective votes, then the more efficient its vote distribution. Hence the expression "win small, lose big." If you're going to win, then don't acquire very large majorities. That only contributes towards your national vote share. It doesn't do anything for your seats. And if you're going to lose, lose big. There's no point in losing by one. You might as well save your energy and lose by many. So now we're going to play around with this vote distribution. So here's our familiar hypothetical country, and there's the outcome of the election. But where the red party wins, we're now going to assume that the distribution of votes was, as before, 60% to the winner and 40% to the party coming second. But in the other remaining constituencies, we're going to assume a slightly different vote distribution. Here, we're assuming that the party that wins, in this case it's the blue party, it wins with 64% of the vote, and the party that comes second gets 36%. So there's a difference in the vote distributions in the two sets of constituencies. Okay, there's the two constituencies, and if we think about the gap in those two constituencies between the lead party and the second party, we can see that difference. In the top constituency there, we can see that the red party has won 60% of the vote, and in the example down below, the blue party's won with 64% of the vote. So what about the gap? Well, there's a 20-point gap in the first constituency, and a bigger gap still in the 28 points in the second constituency. Thinking back, in this example here, what the red party is doing, I can get this mouse to work, there you go, is that the red party has won small relative to the winning position of the blue party here. So it's taken my advice to win small, and it's also taken my advice to lose big, insofar as it's only received 36% of the vote when losing, whereas the blue party has acquired 40% of the vote. So let's think about the national election. Phenomenally, for the third election running, the national vote share is a dead heat. The two parties have got 50% each of the vote, but in terms of the distribution of seats, again, the red party has won, the blue party has come second, and the explanation for the third time lies in this graph here, where you can see that where the red party's won, there's just a 20-point gap between it and second place, but in places where the blue party has won, with a few exceptions, of course, won by the red party, there's been a bigger gap. So more votes have been accumulated by the blue party here that contribute towards the national vote share, but in terms of seats, it's not a very efficient vote distribution. So what we can conclude from this is that in terms of the geography of its vote distribution, the system is biased in favour of the red party and is biased against the blue party, solely because of the way in which the votes were distributed across our 100 constituencies. So, just to recap, what we've done now is explain electoral bias by reference to three factors. First, electorate. Second, turnout. Third, vote distribution. And we've seen in those three examples how each of those bias factors is shaped and formed, and how it contributes towards the result. Now, of course, in a real general election, all of these factors are operating all at the same time. So let's look in more detail at the 2010 general election. That's the distribution in terms of the UK vote. The first column here represents the party's vote share, and the second column represents its seat share. Okay, vote and seats, votes and seats, and so on. Well, coming second in a first past the post voting system is simply not a good idea, and this table shows you that for the Conservatives, in Conservatives won seats, Labour comes second in 137 of those constituencies, and the Liberal Democrats come second in 167. Looking more detail at the Labour won constituencies, the Conservatives are second in 147, and the Liberal Democrats come second in 76. And for the Lib Dems, who won fewer seats, that's the picture in terms of the Conservative and Labour seconds. It's the bottom line, though, that's the, if you like, the clue about the voting system. Whereas Conservatives and Labour have those seconds, the Liberal Democrats are the most successful party coming second, which in a first past the post system, I guess, is not a terribly good strategy. So we know that some bias is caused by the size of electorates, and when those electorates are of different size, then some bias will occur, and we demonstrated that with our first example. What about the 2010 general election? This is the electorate in seats won by Labour, by the Liberal Democrats, and by the Conservatives, and you can see that they are more or less rather similar. So Labour's mean electorate in seats that it won was just over 68,000, just over 69,000 for the Lib Dems, and just over 72,000 for the Conservatives. So not huge difference in electorates in terms of which party won it. What about turnout? There's the turnout in Labour and Liberal Democrat seats, and for the Conservatives. So we know historically that the turnout in recent elections in Labour constituencies has been smaller than the others, and it was once again in 2010. The average was 61% in Labour seats and 68 and 67 for the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. So there are differences in terms of the turnout. What about this notion of surplus and wasted votes, or ineffective votes per seat won? Well, that's the so what we're looking at here is we're taking all the Labour seats, taking those into account, and we're working out how many surplus votes they acquired and how many wasted votes they acquired. And per constituency one, the Labour Party had almost 22,000 ineffective votes. The Conservatives, better, 20,596. So that tells me straight away that in terms of the vote distribution, the Conservative vote distribution in 2010 was better than was Labour's. What about the Liberal Democrats then? Oh dear, well, we're going to have to rescale now, and the reason we rescale is to accommodate that rather large figure. 104,000 almost ineffective votes per seat won. So once again, just to remind you that this is a combination of all of the surplus votes in the seats that it won, to plus all of the wasted votes. Remember, it's very good at coming second, Liberal Democrats. All of those, of course, are wasted votes, and that's why we get such a very large figure. So we immediately know from this simple graphic tells us that there is electoral bias that flows from vote distribution. The Conservatives are doing rather better than Labour in terms of that vote distribution factor, and the Liberal Democrats are doing horrendously by that. If we just look at another way, we can say that in terms of ineffective votes as a percentage of the party's total vote, the Conservatives come out rather well, 59%. Labour is on 66%, but a whopping 87% of the Liberal Democrats' total national vote could be considered as ineffective votes. One of the interesting aspects of a first-past-the-post system is to consider how successful a party is at converting votes into seats. And what we've got here this is for every Conservative candidate. We've listed his or her vote share in rank order. So the Conservative candidate that performed worst of all is located here, and the Conservative candidate that did best of all is located over here. So they're in a rank order of share of vote received. Okay, so ordered Conservative vote shares. Now, in a three-party system, such as ours has almost become, what is interesting is to look at this category of vote share, this 30 to 40 range. And you can easily see from the graph here that where a party, in this case the Conservatives, gets above 40, then it's likely to very good chance of winning the seat. and where it gets below 30, then it's got no chance of winning the seat. So let's look in more detail at this category of where the Conservatives got between 30 and 40% of the vote. That just kind of explodes this kind of area, magnifies this area, and you can see that for every line that's coloured in blue, the party won it, and those in grey, they didn't. And the Tories won 34 of 131 seats. In other words, when it gets 30 to 40% of the vote, it's successful in transferring that vote into a win on 26% of the times. Do exactly the same procedure, ranking them from worst to the best. Again, looking at the 30-40 category, again showing a red line for a Labour win, a grey line for a Labour defeat, and we can see a rather better success rate. 57 of 148 seats won. What about the Lib Dem? That's their vote distribution. We find the 30 to 40 category and we expand it and look in detail at it, and immediately you can see that they only won 9 of 78 seats, a 12% success rate. Just to recap and compare the three: Conservatives 26% conversion, Labour 39%, and the Liberal Democrats 12%. So this is not a very good vote distribution, and explains much of the outcome in terms of why a party should get a rather high national vote share but a rather low return in seats. So we look at the various measures now in terms of the bias, and this tells me about total bias, that the 2010 general election has a bias in favour of Labour of plus 63 seats, but interestingly enough it's got a plus 13 bias in favour of the Conservatives and negative 76 for the Liberal Democrats. Let's look at how that bias was comprised. The electorate, remember that the graph showing different size of electorates they weren't that great. The differences in electorate weren't that great, and you can see there that it's, albeit Labour is advantaged, it's only advantaged by 6 seats, Tories disadvantaged by -7. What about turnout or abstention, to put it another way? Well, in terms of abstention, Labour, because it's low turnout areas, it has high abstention by definition. It's advantaged by that turnout factor, and of plus 13. High turnout areas for the Conservatives mean its bias is negative 11, and similarly high turnout Liberal Democrat areas, it's negative 6 seats. Geography. Remember the vote distribution, the Conservatives were rather better than were Labour at the 2010 general election, which is turns the recent trend on its head. That was worth 31 seats to the Conservatives, 36 seats rather to the Conservatives, 31 seats to Labour, and a whopping -74 seats to the Liberal Democrats. And these other two effects I'm not going to dwell upon in too much detail here and now. So let's just cast our mind back to the 2005 general election, and that's the outcome in terms of the total bias, using the same method that we've just used to look at the 2010. So Labour plus 83, and the system is biased against the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats. Let's just look at where that bias came from. Most of it for Labour from geography, but quite a sizable proportion from the electorate, and more so abstention stroke turnout. And equally the Conservatives are disadvantaged by the electorate factor, and also by the fact that they have high turnout in their constituencies. Now, between the 2005 and 2010 general election, there was a review of boundaries. And the purpose of the boundary review is to examine the problem with electorates. As people migrate from one area to another, then the size of the electorates alter, and that creates problems. And so the purpose of the boundary reviews is to equalise electorates within certain margins. So we would expect, and that's the only job of the boundary commissioners. They're not there to look at the politics of it. They don't take into account the turnout, for example. So we would expect that there would be a reduction in the bias because they're looking at one of the factors that causes bias, i.e. electorate, and that if the boundary commission has been doing their job properly, then there should be some reduction of that bias. And there was. So these are the estimated figures based on the new boundaries of what the 2005 general election would have looked at. And we can immediately see from this figure here that there is a reduction in the bias that favours Labour from plus 11 to just plus 4. And there is the Conservative position improves from minus 12 to minus 6, and the position for the Liberal Democrats also improves. But the other variables, geography, are virtually unchanged, and abstention, turnout, which the Boundary Commission does not take into account at all, is virtually the same as well. So in terms of changing the boundaries, it worked in terms of reducing the bias that was there that favoured Labour and disadvantaged the Conservatives. And remember my opening remarks about all the fuss that was made about this bias that favoured Labour over the Tories, and some people in the Conservative camp thought it was all to do with the fact that the boundaries had been changed in Labour's favour rather than being impartial. So let's look again at the 2010 general election outcome, and I know that the number of seats are going to be reduced to 600, but we don't yet know exactly where. But if we remove, let's assume that all of the electorate bias is removed, the outcome looks like this. In other words, that the system will still be biased in Labour's favour by plus 57. It's still biased in the Conservatives' favour, and even more so compared with what it was before. Their advantage goes from plus 13 to plus 20 now, and the dear old Liberal Democrats are still disadvantaged to the tune of minus 77 seats. So yes, Labour is still advantaged, but the advantage it has relative to the Conservatives reduces if you reduce the electorate bias. But it doesn't disappear altogether because of these boundary changes. So let's just summarise. We can say that Labour continues after the 2010 general election to benefit from positive bias, but the Conservatives are now also beneficiaries, whereas before they were not. Much of the change in bias between the 2005-2010 situation really stems from the different vote distributions, the geography factor. This now favours the Conservatives rather more than it does than does Labour. Labour continues to benefit from abstention, of course. This low turnout factor is still a feature of the general elections that is helping Labour in terms of its position of the national vote share and the seats that it wins. The electorate bias is generally small, but it favours Labour. But the next boundary, therefore, will not radically alter overall bias, even if electorate size bias is removed and the Commons is reduced to 600 seats. Well, there you have it. I hope that clarifies for you what constitutes electoral bias, the factors that contribute towards bias, and how it's played out at the 2010 general election. What we're trying to do here is visualise a rather kind of complex problem, and what we'd now like you to do is to complete the short questionnaire about whether the visualisation has worked for you that accompanies this film. Thank you very much for your participation.